Hi guys, welcome to this video where we're going to take a look at DevOps. Could you afford to miss this video? Probably not, because more and more infrastructure is changing over the years, and as developers, even if you're just a front-end developer, you're still going to need to know this knowledge, and you still really need to understand how to host correctly and what packages to choose correctly. And if you don't make the right choice, it can end up costing you rather a lot. And sometimes it can end up being too difficult to host a particular application, so then you go with more expensive vendors that usually cost you money. If you don't want to end up like that, go ahead and watch this video and hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you want loads of free content like this one that's sharing knowledge and information. So first of all, what is standard sort of server technology? Well, standard server technology, as we know, servers are computers. They've got RAM, CPUs and so forth, and they're normally server grade, so they're a little bit more expensive than your average computer. They're designed with fail-safes in so that your website can still be served out. Most traditional hosts have something called shared hosting, which is a giant computer rack, and this rack contains many computers with lots of CPUs, lots of RAM and lots of hard drives. And also they offer a dedicated host. When your site starts to get more popular, you can't no longer have a shared vested interest in the server rack because you're using too much. So then you have to go to a dedicated host when you start becoming really popular, or you start streaming media, for example. This can also be a very expensive process. But what does that really mean? Well, with shared hosting, you're basically saying, I'm using this resource. I'm using 2 gigabytes of RAM, I'm using 500 gigabyte hard drive, I'm using maybe one CPU, or the CPU normally would be shared. And so you're sharing the cost of the hardware and the services to run the hardware. Those shared servers need to be maintained. They need to still pay an ISP for a 1 terabyte connection usually as a server hoster. And of course, if you start using too much bandwidth and too much processing and memory, you have to go to a dedicated host. Just like you going down to your computer store, buying a computer, plugging it into the internet, that is a dedicated server. That's what the server companies are doing. They have a dedicated computer. Obviously, there's a lot more involved in networking and security, but normally they get a computer, plug it in, and you pay a rental price for that hardware. So really, what I want you to take away from what standard sort of hosting is, which is just basically you are paying for a set amount of hardware each and every month. And so you're just paying for that. Now you're probably going, well, serverless. We still have servers, right? With serverless, you're still going to have a computer, right? There's still got to be a computer there with RAM and CPU to deliver your content to the masses over the network. But the difference with serverless technology is that you're not actually paying a shared price for that server or a specific price for that dedicated host. What you're actually paying for is compute power. And serverless is a lot more flexible, and this will become apparent when you actually look at virtual machines, which is what we'll do next. But serverless doesn't mean that there isn't a computer there. It doesn't mean there isn't a physical computer serving out your data. What it means is you're not paying the set shared price. You're not paying for the dedicated hardware. This is all to do with hardware and how it's being rented from you. So with those things, they're dedicated to you. That's a dedicated, all that resource is dedicated to you. And whether you use that or not is going to cost you that amount. Same with shared hosting. If you don't use your portion of shared hosting, it's still going to cost you that much every month. So serverless technology is much more flexible. It's still a server. It's still a computer. But think of it like a virtual machine. So I have a computer, a box, right? And that computer I can install virtual machines on. And what you're really doing is you're only actually paying for the CPU that you're using, the RAM that you're using. And if I boot up multiple VMs, you can think of these VMs as customers. I can have a giant computer rack, a big computer rack, and all I need is one operating system, and I start booting up virtual machines. And depending on how much data you're going to use, CPU and RAM is normally how much hardware processing power you're going to use. That is actually what you're paying for. So you're not paying a dedicated price for that much RAM, that much CPU power, and da-da-da. What you're actually paying for is how much you use of these things. Hence why it's technically serverless. You are in a virtual machine. This computer that you've got can have several virtual machines on there. And those virtual machines, you can increase the RAM, you can increase the CPU, and so forth. But don't think of it like setting it that way, because that wouldn't be correct. What you're actually doing is you're saying, I could use up to 2 CPUs, I could use up to 4 gigabytes of RAM, and normally they'd charge a flat price for that. But then they will also say, for example, when you use that amount of RAM, and I've got all these virtual machines, and people log into those virtual machines, and they can put their content on there, they can upload stuff, they can serve out websites and configure their websites. And when those websites start using CPU, and when they start using RAM, and when they start using these things, okay, you can set a baseline. So I need this much RAM. I need ideally this much as a base plate. But if you go over, that's fine too. If you go over, unlike a dedicated host or classical hosting, you have to go to another package, you have to go to another tier. Whereas serverless, it just charges you for what you're actually using in the thing. And if they have to allocate, if you say to them, right, initially I want you to allocate me 4 gigabytes of RAM, 2 CPUs, da-da-da, if you don't use those things, the price could potentially come down. Whereas if you overutilize them, and let's say you start using 5 gigabytes of RAM, your website doesn't automatically get shut down. What happens is they will charge you for the CPU and memory. And if you're saying you're going to use 4 gigs of RAM and 2 virtual CPUs, notice the word virtual CPUs, then as a result, they will charge you a base plate price for that, because that's technically what you're saying initially, I need that compute power. But then if you start overutilizing it, because it's a virtual machine, because it's kind of more virtual, it's not set in concrete like dedicated hosts, the virtual machine gets to decide how much sort of RAM and CPU, it will monitor how much RAM and CPU you're using, and then it will charge you for that usage. So serverless doesn't mean that there isn't a computer there, but it's more virtual, and it elasticates as well. This is what makes serverless really great, is the fact that let's say my site does really great in certain periods of the month. You'll get this a lot with e-commerce clients. So towards the December time, people are going to want to buy more stuff. Okay, we need to up the bandwidth. Excellent. You can just stretch that out. You can up the bandwidth. You can up the RAM. You can up the virtual CPUs, virtual RAM, virtual CPUs. And of course, what's really great about that is you can also decrease that when you don't need it. So for example, in let's say July time, sales drop off naturally. Do I need all of that compute power like a dedicated host that says, nope, that's you, that's your hardware, you're paying that price? This price grows and shrinks as your business grows and shrinks. It's called elastic hosting. So what are the pros and cons of each one? Well, with a dedicated server, don't get me wrong, there are some pros. Like for example, you know what your bill is going to be exactly. And number two, with a dedicated host, you do have quite a lot of control over it, but the downside, the real downside to serverless technology is upgrading. Okay, so you look at shared hosting, you're renting a section of that hardware for that price. You start going over, they want you to go to a dedicated host. That means you need to replicate everything onto the brand new computer they've just plugged into the internet for you, and that's fine. Now, obviously, that computer that they're plugging in should be able to be upgradable at some point. You know, you've got your motherboard, right? You've probably got a few RAM slots empty. They could probably add some RAM. They could probably add some CPUs. The real downside is when you've maximized the potential of that dedicated computer, I've got to re-replicate it all over again. Or I've got to do load balancing with dedicated hosts. And then I've got to replicate everything that I'm doing again. And so it's a bit of a pain in the bottom. Now, with serverless technology, the pros are that, number one, it can actually be cheaper because your prices can go up when they need to go up, when you've got more customers, and when you've got a down slump, you can bring it right down. And you don't have to reinstall anything, you don't have to change tiers. You can do this on the fly. Now, the other really great thing about this technology is that it has all of these compute power all across the board. So if I need to expand or detract, I don't have to reinstantiate that instance, my server, my website, right? All I have to do is expand and contract the actual resources that the website uses. And if I go over, it's not, whoa, 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 you've gone over, you need to go to, no. It will just carry on doing it, but it will charge you for that extra RAM that you've used, that extra CPU that you've used, that extra disk space that you've used or utilizing. And so that is how that works. All right, guys, so if you really love this content, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. I've got loads of more free content for you guys. And if you go to the Avelx website, you can sign up for the newsletter where I'll be distributing premium and free content as well. Come and join us. And thank you very much for watching.